Hello again. At this point, let's talk about the types of bilingual education systems followed in many countries. Okay, the first one is submersion, aka sink or swim, also known as sink or swim. Popularly known as sink or swim, this educational setting is simply mainstream education with no planning for the inclusion of students who do not speak the majority language. They just put the students into the school. Okay, for example, you have a minority language, you just take them to school. Linguistic differences are not overtly recognized in the curriculum. Language minority students are simply put into classes where instruction, materials, and assessment are solely in the majority language. Most language minority students fail to learn in these settings. Although most become monolingual in the majority language in the process, they lose their own language. They become monolingual in the majority language. This is the most common educational program for language minority students in societies that do not recognize their linguistic diversity. The goal is for the minority students to assimilate, force them to become like the rest of us, get rid of their own ethnicity. So this is called submersion, also known as sink or swim. Okay. And then when people decide, well, let's have a little bit of help, then we have what we call submersion plus withdrawal second language classes. This type of program is the easiest to plan and requires the least resources, and thus may be the most popular in the world today. So in this case, language minority students attend the mainstream classes where no provisions are made for them. In that sense, they are actually in the submersion education in the majority language for all content. However, they are withdrawn or pulled out for second language instruction. So there's a separate class for those minority students in which they are taught the minority language, the majority language with the language teacher. So, for example, you have a bunch of agta and you force them to attend the Tagalog school, school where majority are Tagalog. Well, submersion plus withdrawal second language classes means you give them a separate class where you try to teach them Tagalog or Filipino. Okay, so they are pulled out for second language instruction. The purpose of this type of program is to facilitate the acquisition of the majority language for the minority speakers to learn the majority language with little consideration paid to the education of the language minority student. So as soon as the students become bilingual, the instruction stops. So for example, when the AGTA could already speak a good amount of Filipino or Tagalog, the the teaching stops. They're no longer withdrawn for another class. Okay, that's submersion plus withdrawal second language classes. So the goal is still assimilation to mainstream education. Okay. Then we also have structured immersion. It is also called sheltered English. Students are grouped based on level of proficiency. Teachers are certified in teaching English as a second language. The goal is linguistic assimilation and There's exit into the mainstream. So from this structured immersion or sheltered English system, they leave that system and they go to the mainstream setup. So in this type of program, which is popular recently in the United States, language minority students are immersed in instruction which uses solely the majority language. Structured immersion differs from the submersion program described above in that there has been some amount of educational planning. So that's the difference. There's some amount of educational planning. Instruction is solely for language minority students who are learning the majority language, with material in the majority language which has been designed for language learners, but with a teacher who uses only the majority language. So the materials given here are still in the majority language, but it's a little bit simplified in order to cater to the needs of the language minority. Okay, the purpose of the program is to accelerate the acquisition of the majority language so that they could learn English fast, for example, or Filipino fast. The purpose of the program is to again accelerate the learning of English. Okay, there's little consideration as to the quality of education that students receive. So as long as you do it, it's okay. Doesn't really matter whether you as a teacher do it well. Okay. Now, as soon as children become bilingual, they are once again transferred to the mainstream monolingual classes. So this further accelerates the shift to the majority language. Again, as we said, in the United States, this is called sheltered English. Okay. The goal is still assimilation to the mainstream culture. Okay, that's structured immersion. And then we have what we call segregationist. This kind of bilingual setup is planned by a language majority which wants to exclude a language minority. Okay, this type of program uses solely the minority language in the education of the minority. Okay, solely the minority language because the planners don't want the the people there, the students there, to participate in the bigger language society. Okay? So this type of monolingual education aims to keep the language minority separate and excluded from participating in society. So for example, in South Africa, under apartheid is official racism against blacks. Maybe that will appear in the left also. Apartheid. This is the racist system previously in South Africa. So, South Africa once had a segregationist educational system for all Bantu speakers. Bantu is the language of black people there. And with instructions solely in their native language. Okay? So it was the Bantu Education Act was passed in 1953, and black children were taught only skills applicable to factory jobs. Okay, they were not taught uh, better skills. And school was only for 3 hours. Okay, so under the act, the Department of Native Affairs, headed by Henrik Verwoerd, was made responsible for the education of black South Africans. So in 1958, the Department of Bantu Education was established. The act required black children to attend the government schools. Teaching was to take place in the students' native tongue, although the syllabus included classes in English and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is the language of South Africa, of white South Africans. It came from Dutch. Okay, Afrikaans is the descendant of Dutch in South Africa. In the instruction was mandated in needlework for girls, handcraft, planting, and soil conservation, as well as in arithmetic, social studies, and Christian religion. The education was aimed at training the students for the manual labor and menial jobs that the government felt was suitable for blacks. They really looked down on blacks. They thought that blacks are capable only of doing menial jobs. Okay, and the idea was they will be subservient to white South Africans. Now, funding for the schools were to have come from taxes paid by the communities that they served, which means that black schools received only a small fraction of the amount of money that was available for their white counterparts. And so, as a result, there was a profound shortage of qualified teachers. And teacher student ratios range from 40 to 1 to 60 to 1. Okay? So, there was a lack of qualified teachers. And anyway, the teachers would only teach menial jobs. Okay? So, segregationist education intends to exclude a particular minority group from the larger society, particularly from better opportunities. Okay, then we have transitional. This is the system in the Philippines. The subjects in the lower grade levels are taught using the minority language. Students are minority language speakers, and there are special classes for teaching the majority language, English and Filipino, to minority students. Now, after a certain grade level, students are transferred to classes where subjects are taught using the majority language only. And then there's early exit, meaning the students leave the system at a lower level, at a low level, only in grade 3. Some people recommend at least grade 6, but it's just grade 3 that after grade 3, they leave the system. So it's called early exit. Okay. This type of educational program is most popular in the United States for the education of language minorities, where some positive action has been taken. So a little bit of help. It requires planning and resources. Initially, the students' minority language is used, with the minority language being taught as a second language, most often by the same bilingual teacher. Progressively, both languages are used in instruction with little compartmentalization between them. Eventually, students are transferred out of the bilingual classroom to a monolingual one. So in grade 4 in the Philippines, grade 4 up to grade 12, it's all Filipino and English. There's no more minority language. The transition from bilingualism in instruction when the student is monolingual to monolingual instruction when the student is bilingual is planned in order to accelerate the shift to the majority language. So the goal is still for students to become adept in the majority language. So it still doesn't value the minority language that much. Okay, the idea is just to scaffold students, not really valuing minority languages that much. Okay, then we also have mainstream plus withdrawal for foreign or second language classes. Now, class in this type, the students are taught using the majority language in a monolingual setting for all their educational needs. Now, in addition, students are given special classes to learn another language. This depends on the perception of educational policymakers regarding how important it is for students to learn that other language. A good case is Japanese children being taught English. So, what happens here is all the subjects are taught using the majority language and the students are speakers of the majority language. But they are withdrawn, they are given a special course, a special subject for teaching another language, usually a dominant language in the international scene. So a good example are the Japanese. So they're taught in Japan using Japanese in all their subjects, but they have a special subject in English. That's just it. Okay, because they're supposed to be able to participate in international discourse. Okay, and then we have mainstream plus supplementary foreign or second language classes. This is similar to mainstream plus withdrawal for foreign or second language classes, but in this case, the parents, not the school, nor the educational system, takes the initiative for developing learners' proficiency in another language. They pay for classes during weekends for their children to acquire a target language. An example could be Filipino Chinese learning Mandarin as initiated by the parents instead of the school. So the school will not provide for subjects, for classes in Mandarin, but the parents would like to have their children learn Mandarin. So they have special subjects in Mandarin. So examples are Filipino Chinese children in their schools. Maybe they have Hokkien. Maybe they are taught a little bit of Hokkien, but they're not taught Mandarin, which is a widespread language in China and other places, Taiwan, Singapore, even in Hong Kong. But it's the parents who take the initiative because they believe they believe that their children need to learn Mandarin, which the school doesn't agree with. Okay, so it's the parents who take the initiative. So it's mainstream plus supplementary foreign or second language classes. And then we have separatist with withdrawal second language classes. Remember, class, this is separatist. This is not segregationist. Okay? In this type of bilingual education, it is the minority that directs the education system. So needless to say, in this situation, the minority has a significant capability to do so, which means that the minority has financial resources, even some amount of political power to take over the education of minority students. In this type, all educational processes are conducted in the minority language. There may be special classes in which the majority language is taught. This type is intended to lead to political autonomy for the minority. An example of this is the Ikastola system in the Basque region of Spain, a region which has a history of seeking independence from Spain. And this system was during the dictatorship of Franco in Spain. So the people in the Basque region, they have significant resources. They have money, they have some amount of political power, and so they are able to take over the education system of their children. And they wanted their children to develop a separate cultural identity from Spain. So the focus is on developing the Basque culture. Okay, so in this case, the educational processes are all in the Basque language because the idea is the people in the Basque region want to be independent from the rest of Spain. So again, the language used is that of the minority language, but the minority has a lot of resources, even political power. And the idea is to eventually separate themselves from the rest of the larger society. In this case, Spain. Okay? There's also what we call two-way or dual language immersion. In this type of bilingual education system, the subjects are taught in both the majority and minority languages. One of the main goals is to produce students who are proficient in bilingual and biliterate in both languages. So they are proficient, they are bilingual, they are biliterate in both languages. The intent is to produce a multilingual and multicultural society. In this system, the class is a mixture of majority and minority language students. So the English-speaking Americans, for example, they are also taught in Spanish. The migrant Spanish students, they're taught in English also. So the majority students are immersed in the minority language, and the minority language is immersed in the majority language, eventually producing multilingualism and a multicultural society. So this is a little bit positive. Okay. And then there's mainstream plus supplementary heritage language classes. So in this system, the education of learners is done through the majority or mainstream language. However, parents and other members of the heritage ethno-linguistic community to which the learners belong or hold affinity organize classes in which the heritage language and culture is taught. This is the case for migrants who have a strong affinity with the ethno-linguistic group from which they came. Needless to say, the members of the heritage community have enough resources to set up such a supplementary ethno-education program. So for example, in the Philippines, you have Chinese who have migrated to the Philippines. They attend a school, but in the school, there's no regard for Chinese culture. So what the parents do is they plan as a supplementary heritage language class. So for example, they pay for a Hokkien speaker, a Hokkien teacher to teach their children how to speak and write in Hokkien. Okay? Because many of the Chinese who came to the Philippines came from the Chinese province of Hokkien, where the language is Hokkien. But then they come to the Philippines, their children are Chinese, they study in Filipino schools. There's no provision for Chinese language or Chinese culture. But the parents who are Chinese, they have affinity with China, particularly with Hokkien. So they want their children to retain their culture. So they pay for heritage language classes where culture is also taught. Again, as I said, needless to say, the minority here has significant resources to do this. Okay? They have significant money and maybe a little bit of political power. Okay? Then we have only 4 slides more. We have maintenance. Now, as the term implies, this type seeks to maintain knowledge of the minority culture and proficiency in the minority language among minority language students. Both majority and minority languages are used for teaching. So you use the majority language and the minority language. The students here are language minority students. Students in a maintenance bilingual education program should graduate being able to have a discussion about any content area in either language. So the idea is maintenance. So you have, for example, a dying language or a language that people think might be threatened. They want their children to maintain that language. So what happens is both majority and minority languages are used for teaching. Okay, even though the students are minority students. Okay, they should be able to graduate and be able to discuss any content area in either language. So this is done by a school where they seek to maintain knowledge of the minority culture because the minority culture is already dying. Okay, this is different from heritage language classes because the motive of the heritage language classes is to maintain cultural affinity from where the parents came from, like in Hokkien province. But in the case of maintenance, there's a language minority whose culture is dying, so students are intended to be strong in that minority language. Maybe a good example of this would be Pangasinense or Kapampangan, where you have Tagalog schools, but you have Kapampangan students, and they are taught using English, Filipino, and Kapampangan. And when they graduate, they should be able to discuss uh, any subject using Kapampangan or Pangasinense in the case of Pangasinan. Okay. Next is immersion. Immersion is a form of bilingual education that provides students with a sheltered classroom environment in which they receive at least half of their subject matter instruction through the medium of a language that they are learning as a second, foreign, heritage, or indigenous language. So they're learning, they have some of their subject matter taught using the medium of a language that they are learning. Okay. Now, this intends to make majority or high status language students proficient in the minority language. So you have majority language students trying to be proficient in the minority language. First, they are taught using the minority language, which is the target language, and then progressively taught using the majority language, which is their first language. This type was first developed in Canada with English-speaking students being taught using French by a bilingual teacher. It showed success and its use has spread elsewhere. Okay? And then you have mainstream bilingual. Okay? This is similar to a maintenance program, but in this case, all languages are considered majority languages. Okay, by the way, class, this is a good example of this are European schools. For example, in Belgium, uh, you have French, you have German, you have Spanish, and all of them are considered majority languages. In Switzerland, you have French, you have German, and all of them are considered, and both of them are considered majority languages. Okay, so all languages are considered majority languages, and all students in this type are majority language speakers. An example of this is the Dvibahasa system in Brunei. The educational system involves instruction for all Malay-speaking children in both Malay and English. Another example, sorry, another example is the trilingual education in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. In the in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, what happened was there was a good quality of Frisian and results of Dutch at the same level at the end of grade 8 as all pupils in the Netherlands. Okay. And the results for English is slightly better, but not significant. There is self-consciousness in English. It's much better, but it's not significant. Okay, this is in the case of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Because in Europe, it's very common for a country to have two languages that are both prestigious and strong. Okay, like I said, in Belgium you have French and Spanish, French and German, and even Spanish. Okay, and they are both considered majority languages. Okay, And then finally, you have two-way mainstream bilingual. Or maybe if it's three languages, four languages, it's multi-way mainstream multilingual. So in this type of bilingual education system, students come from several different ethno-linguistic groups, but all of them are considered majority language groups. Initially, students from each ethno-linguistic group are put in one class and instructed using their mother tongue while also being taught in other languages. With all languages being equally valued, this system produces multilingual and multiliterate students. Okay, so for example, in Belgium, all French students are put in one class. They're instructed using French, but they're also taught German and Spanish. The German speaking student, they're in a class, they're taught using German, but they are taught Spanish. The same thing with French. So what happens is, because all the languages are valued, the system produces a multilingual and multiliterate students. So class in Europe, it's very common that Europeans are actually bicultural. They are both French culturally and German culturally. They're French and Spanish. Okay, that's very common in Europe. That's what happens when you value a language. You produce multiculturalism. Okay, so these are types of bilingual education systems in the world. And it's almost 12 o'clock. We will continue at 1 o'clock. Okay, at this point, do you have any questions? Let me stop recording. Okay.